The sun-drenched horizon swallowed the last crimson rays as 10-year-old Felicity Hawkins sat beside the creek, her bare feet dangling in the cool water, completely unaware that the dusty-faced boy approaching would someday hold her heart. It was the summer of 1865, and the small town of Willow Springs, Colorado, was just beginning to heal from the wounds of the Civil War. The adults spoke in hushed tones about Reconstruction and uncertain futures, but children like Felicity and Xavier Yates concerned themselves only with catching frogs and avoiding chores. "What ya doing?" Xavier asked, plopping down beside her, his worn denim overalls already bearing the marks of a day spent exploring. Felicity glanced up, brushing a strand of chestnut hair from her eyes. "Just thinking. Pa says we might have to move again if the mine doesn't turn around." Xavier's face fell. His family had settled in Willow Springs 3 years ago when his father decided ranching offered better prospects than chasing gold like so many others. The Yates family was one of the few stable fixtures in a town where families came and went with the success of the silver mine. "You can't leave," Xavier declared with the certainty only a child could muster. "We're friends." Felicity smiled sadly. She'd already lost too many friends to the transient nature of mining towns. "Friends always say they'll write, but they never do." Xavier's brow furrowed with determination. "Then we need something better than just being friends, something secret that's just ours." He extended his hand, palm up. "My pa showed me this. It's how the men in his cavalry unit greeted each other." He guided her through the motions, a clasp of the hands, followed by a twist of the wrists, then 3 quick taps with their thumbs against each other's hands, and finally a firm shake that ended with their little fingers hooking together. "It's our promise," Xavier explained solemnly. "Whenever we do this, no matter how old we get or how far apart we are, we'll remember we're special to each other." Felicity mimicked the movements until they flowed smoothly. "A secret handshake," she whispered, delighted. "Not just any handshake," Xavier corrected. "Ours." For the remainder of that summer, they practiced their handshake whenever they met. Sometimes they'd add flourishes, a snap or a clap, but the core sequence remained unchanged. It became their ritual, their unspoken language. When autumn came, Felicity's father announced they would remain in Willow Springs after all. He'd secured a position as the mine's accountant, a job less vulnerable to the mine's fluctuating fortunes. Xavier and Felicity celebrated by performing their handshake beside the creek, where the leaves had begun to turn golden. Years passed in the way they do in small western towns, slowly, and yet too quickly. Felicity and Xavier remained friends through childhood mishaps, school lessons, and the gradual awareness that divided boys and girls as they approached adolescence. Their handshake persisted, though increasingly performed out of sight of teasing peers. By the time Felicity turned 15, her mother had begun instructing her in the ways of becoming a proper lady. "You're too old to be gallivanting around with that Yates boy," her mother chided. "What will people think?" But on quiet afternoons, when chores were done and her mother was occupied with social calls, Felicity would still meet Xavier by their creek. They spoke of dreams hers to become a teacher, his to expand his father's modest ranch into something significant. Then came the winter of 1870. An influenza epidemic swept through Willow Springs, claiming several lives, including Xavier's mother. The Yates household darkened with grief. Xavier, just 15, shouldered responsibilities beyond his years, helping his father manage both the ranch and his 3 younger siblings. Felicity brought food and offered help, but Xavier withdrew into himself. Their creek meetings became less frequent. Their handshake, when performed, felt weighted with unspoken sorrow. On a bitter cold February morning, Felicity arrived at the creek to find Xavier waiting, his face solemn. "Pa's sending me to my uncle's ranch in Montana," he said without preamble. "Says I need to learn more about cattle if we're ever going to make our place work. I'll be gone at least 2 years. Felicity felt the world tilt beneath her feet. 2 years, maybe more. His voice cracked slightly. At 15, he stood taller than she remembered, his shoulders broadening, his face losing its childish softness. "I leave tomorrow. Tomorrow." The word was barely a whisper. They sat in silence as the creek bubbled before them, seemingly unconcerned with human sorrows. Finally, Xavier extended his hand. They performed their handshake slowly, deliberately, each movement a memorization. "I'll come back, Felicity, I promise." She nodded, not trusting her voice. They remained by the creek until the sky darkened, speaking of trivial things, avoiding the enormity of tomorrow's separation. Xavier left before dawn the next morning. Felicity stood on her porch, watching the road long after his silhouette had disappeared. She was 16 years old and didn't understand why her heart felt fractured. 2 years stretched into 3, then 4. Letters arrived sporadically. Xavier wrote of vast Montana skies, cattle drives, and learning the business of ranching. Felicity responded with news of Willow Springs, her completion of schooling, and her position assisting the town's aging teacher. In the spring of 1874, a letter arrived announcing Xavier's return. By then, Felicity was 19, her childhood dreams of teaching fulfilled, though on a smaller scale than she'd imagined. Willow Springs had grown modestly, boasting a proper school building where she taught the younger children while the elderly Mr. Patterson handled the older students. She wore her best dress the day Xavier was expected to return, a pale blue cotton with delicate embroidery at the collar that her mother insisted brought out the color of her eyes. She arranged her hair with more care than usual and debated whether to wait at home or casually position herself near the general store where travelers typically stopped. In the end, she did neither. An impulse drew her to their creek, where the afternoon sun dappled the water through fresh spring leaves. She sat on their familiar rock, remembering the children they had been. The sound of approaching footsteps made her pulse quicken. She turned to find a man she almost didn't recognize. Xavier Yates had left as a boy of 15. He returned as a man of 20. Taller, broader, sun-darkened, with eyes that had seen more of the world than most men twice his age, he stopped a few paces away, hat in hand. "Felicity Hawkins," he said, his voice deeper than she remembered. "I thought I might find you here." She stood, suddenly conscious of how the years had changed her as well. "Welcome home, Xavier." Neither moved toward the other. The space between them seemed filled with the ghosts of their younger selves and the uncertainty of who they had become. Then Xavier extended his hand, palm up, in a gesture so familiar it made her throat tighten. Without hesitation, her hand met his. The handshake flowed between them, the clasp, the twist, the 3 taps, the shake, the hooked pinkies as naturally as if they'd performed it yesterday. "Still ours," Xavier said softly when they finished. Something shifted in Felicity's heart. "Still ours," she echoed. Xavier stayed in Willow Springs, working alongside his father to rebuild and expand the Yates ranch. He brought with him new techniques learned in Montana and an ambition that quickly earned the respect of other ranchers in the area. He and Felicity resumed their friendship, though it was colored now by an awareness of each other that hadn't existed before. They were often seen together at church socials and town gatherings, raising eyebrows and prompting whispered speculation. Felicity's mother alternated between concern about her daughter's reputation and calculations about the growing prosperity of the Yates ranch. "He'll make a good match for someone," she remarked pointedly one evening as Felicity graded student papers. "Though he still has that wildness about him. Montana did that, I expect." Felicity merely nodded, unwilling to examine too closely the way her heart raced whenever Xavier entered a room. In the autumn of 1874, disaster struck Willow Springs. A fire, started in the dry goods store by an overturned lantern, spread rapidly through the wooden structures of the main street. The schoolhouse, where Felicity had been working late, was among the buildings consumed. Xavier found her standing amidst the chaos, watching helplessly as flames engulfed her classroom. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, gripping her shoulders, his face blackened with soot from helping with the bucket brigade. No, but all the books, the supplies, her voice broke. The children worked so hard on their projects for the harvest festival. He pulled her away from the heat of the flames. Things can be replaced. You can't. In the days that followed, Willow Springs rallied to rebuild. Xavier and his father contributed lumber and labor. Temporary classrooms were established in the church, while plans were made for a new brick schoolhouse. Felicity threw herself into the recovery efforts, organizing donations of books and materials. She and Xavier often worked side by side, their childhood friendship deepening into something neither was prepared to name. One evening, as they sorted through a shipment of donated readers from Denver, Xavier paused, watching Felicity carefully label each book. "You love teaching," he observed. She looked up, surprised by his tone. "I do, it's all I ever wanted." Even now, with everything else you could do, Felicity considered the question. At 19, unmarried and independent, she occupied an unusual position for a woman in a frontier town. What else would I do? Xavier shrugged, returning to the crate of books. "Some might expect you to marry, have a family." "Is that what you expect?" His eyes met hers, serious in the lamplight. "I expect you to do what makes you happy, Felicity. Always have." Before she could respond, they were interrupted by the arrival of more volunteers. The moment passed, but Felicity found herself returning to it in quiet moments, wondering at the intensity in Xavier's gaze. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing Willow Springs in snow before Thanksgiving. The rebuilding slowed but didn't stop entirely. The town had changed since the fire. Some businesses relocated, others expanded, and a few families departed for more established communities. Felicity worried that her father might consider moving again, but he surprised her by purchasing a small newspaper that had been struggling. "This town is growing," he explained. "It needs a proper voice." Christmas approached with a festive spirit despite the recent hardships. The new schoolhouse was partially complete, enough to host the annual Christmas pageant. Felicity directed the children in their performances while Xavier helped construct the makeshift stage. The night of the pageant, snow fell in thick, silent flakes. The schoolhouse was crowded with families eager for celebration after months of rebuilding. Candles illuminated the windows, and evergreen boughs decorated the walls. Felicity stood at the back, watching proudly as her students recited poems and sang carols. She felt a presence beside her and turned to find Xavier, his expression warm as he observed the children. "You've done a fine job with them," he said quietly. "They've been through so much this year. So have you." The pageant concluded with enthusiastic applause. As families gathered their children and prepared to brave the snowy night, Xavier touched Felicity's elbow. "Walk with me a moment." They stepped outside where the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the departing crowd. Xavier led her to the side of the building where a small garden would be planted in spring. "I have something for you," he said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. "Christmas isn't for 3 more days," Felicity protested. "This couldn't wait." She unwrapped the package to reveal a book, not a new one, but a well-worn copy of Pride and Prejudice. "Your favorite," Xavier explained. "You mentioned once that your copy was lost in the fire. I wrote to bookshops in Denver and Cheyenne until I found one." Felicity ran her fingers over the embossed cover, touched beyond words. "You remembered." "I remember everything about you, Felicity." She looked up to find him watching her intently, snowflakes catching in his dark hair. "I've been trying to find the right way to say this," he continued, his voice low. "I'm not good with words like the characters in your books, but I need you to know that what I felt for you before I left for Montana was just the beginning." "Coming back, seeing the woman you've become," he broke off, seeming to struggle with his next words. Then, deliberately, he extended his hand. Palm up. Felicity's heart pounded as she placed her hand in his. They performed their handshake in the falling snow, their movements synchronized by memory and something deeper. Still ours, Xavier said when they finished, but this time his fingers remained intertwined with hers. Everything between us has always been ours, Felicity. And if you'll have me, I want to make a life that's ours too. She stared at him, understanding dawning. Xavier Yates, are you proposing to me in a snowstorm? A smile tugged at his mouth. Seems I am. Not very romantic, is it? On the contrary, she whispered, stepping closer. It's perfect. The kiss that followed was gentle, tentative a first exploration. When they parted, Xavier's expression was one of wonder. I should have done that years ago, he murmured. Felicity laughed softly. We weren't ready years ago. They walked back toward town hand in hand, discussing possibilities. Xavier spoke of his plans for the ranch, how he wanted to build a proper house, one with a room that could serve as a study for Felicity. You wouldn't expect me to stop teaching, she asked. I'd never ask you to give up something that makes you who you are, he replied. Though you might want to teach our children someday, rather than everyone else's. The mention of children brought a blush to her cheeks that had nothing to do with the cold. They agreed to speak to her parents the following day. As expected, Felicity's mother was thrilled by the match, while her father questioned Xavier thoroughly about his intentions and ability to provide for his daughter. I respect that she's a teacher, Xavier assured him. I don't intend to change that unless she wishes it. Mr. Hawkins studied the young man before him, then nodded slowly. You've grown into a fine man, Xavier, different from most around here. The engagement was announced at the Christmas service, causing a ripple of excitement through the congregation. Most had suspected the childhood friends would eventually pair off, but few had anticipated such a swift proposal following Xavier's return. Winter passed in a flurry of preparations. Felicity continued teaching while helping design the house Xavier was building on the ranch. Xavier divided his time between ranching duties and construction, determined to have their home ready by the June wedding they had planned. Spring brought its own challenges. Heavy rains swelled the rivers, threatening the lower pastures of the Yates ranch. Xavier and his father worked tirelessly to move cattle to higher ground and reinforce the banks where possible. One night, Felicity rode out to the ranch with food for the exhausted men. She found Xavier by the river, soaked and muddy, directing workers as they piled sandbags. You shouldn't be out in this, he said when he spotted her, but his weary smile betrayed his pleasure at seeing her. Neither should you, but here we are. She handed him a container of hot stew. Eat before you collapse. They took shelter under a makeshift tarp, watching the rain pound the swollen river. Despite the precarious situation, Felicity felt a sense of rightness sitting beside him, sharing this challenge as they would share all future ones. The house might be delayed, Xavier said between mouthfuls. I've had to pull men from construction to help with the flood control. We can postpone the wedding if needed. He shook his head firmly. Not a chance. I've waited long enough to make you my wife. If the house isn't ready, we'll stay with Pa until it is. The rain continued for nearly 2 weeks. When it finally ceased, the damage was assessed. The Yates ranch had fared better than many, thanks to Xavier's foresight in strengthening the riverbanks. Construction resumed on their house, though at a slower pace due to mud and damaged materials. May arrived with wildflowers and warming breezes. The town continued its recovery from both fire and flood, displaying the resilience typical of Western communities. The new schoolhouse was completed, larger and sturdier than its predecessor. Felicity took particular pride in the library corner, stocked with books donated from across the territory. As the wedding approached, Xavier surprised Felicity one afternoon by collecting her from the schoolhouse. I want to show you something, he said, helping her onto his horse. He took her to their creek, now flowing vigorously with spring runoff. On the bank stood a small wooden bench, clearly handcrafted. I made it myself, Xavier explained as they sat down. Figured we should have a proper place to sit after all these years of rocks and logs. Felicity ran her hand over the smooth wood, noting the carving on the back, their initials intertwined. It's wonderful, she said sincerely. This place is important, Xavier continued. It's where we became friends, where we created our handshake, seemed right to mark it somehow. Felicity leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you remember the day we made up the handshake? You were so determined to give me something to remember you by, and then you didn't even leave, he chuckled. But I'm glad we had it when I left instead. Those 4 years felt like forever. Xavier wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I wrote you letters I never sent, you know, pages of things I was too young and foolish to say. Like what? He gazed at the flowing creek. That I missed the sound of your laugh, that Montana sunsets made me think of your hair in certain light. That I measured every girl I met against you and found them all wanting. Felicity's heart swelled. I would have liked to read those letters. I burned them before coming home, thought I should start fresh, see who you'd become instead of holding on to who you were. And who have I become, Xavier Yates? He turned to face her fully. Everything I hoped for and more than I deserve. The June wedding was held in the newly rebuilt church, flowers adorning every pew. Felicity wore a gown of ivory satin that her mother had ordered from Denver, with a veil of delicate lace. Xavier, unaccustomed to formal attire, tugged at his collar throughout the ceremony, stopping only when Felicity whispered, "Be still, or I'll make you repeat the handshake in front of everyone." The threat, delivered with a smile that only he could see, calmed him immediately. Their vows were traditional but spoken with such evident feeling that several guests dabbed at their eyes. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier kissed Felicity with a restrained passion that promised more when they were alone. The celebration continued at the newly completed schoolhouse, transformed for the occasion with bunting and lanterns. The entire town attended, bringing gifts and well wishes. Even Mr. Patterson danced, partnering a surprised Mrs. Hawkins for a lively reel. As evening approached, Xavier led Felicity away from the festivities. Their house on the ranch wasn't quite finished. The upstairs remained partially incomplete, but the main floor was habitable. He had insisted on carrying her over the threshold properly, away from prying eyes. They rode in a wagon decorated by Xavier's siblings with ribbons and flowers. As they approached the ranch, Felicity gasped at the sight of their house. Lanterns had been hung from the porch, casting a warm glow in the gathering dusk. "Your father and brothers," she guessed. Xavier nodded. "They wanted it to be special for us." He lifted her from the wagon and carried her up the steps, pausing at the door. "Welcome home, Mrs. Yates." Inside, more surprises awaited. The rooms had been furnished simply but tastefully, with pieces Felicity recognized from both their families. Fresh flowers stood in vases, and a small table was set for two by the fireplace. "Your mother," Xavier explained before she could ask. "She and my sisters came out this morning to prepare everything." Felicity wandered through the rooms, touching furniture and peering into cupboards already stocked with essentials. The study Xavier had promised her contained a desk positioned before a large window overlooking the distant mountains. "It's perfect," she whispered, returning to where he waited in the main room. They shared a simple supper, both too filled with anticipation to eat much. As night fell completely, Xavier rose and extended his hand to her. "Come to bed, wife," he said softly. In their bedroom, nervousness overtook them both. Xavier fumbled with buttons, and Felicity's hands trembled as she removed pins from her hair. They laughed at their own awkwardness, the tension easing with shared humor. "We should remember this moment," Felicity said as Xavier helped her with the back of her dress. "How even after knowing each other almost our whole lives, we can still be shy." "I think there will be many moments worth remembering," he replied, his voice deepening as the dress slipped from her shoulders. Later, as they lay entwined in the darkness, Felicity traced patterns on his chest. "I never imagined this when we were children making up secret handshakes." Xavier caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I think perhaps I did in some way. Even then, I knew you were special to me. I just didn't understand how or why." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, the first night of many in their new home. The years that followed brought both joy and challenges. The Yates ranch prospered under Xavier's progressive management. Felicity continued teaching until the birth of their first child, a daughter they named Clara. She returned to the classroom part-time after Clara's first birthday, bringing the baby with her initially, much to the delight of her students. Willow Springs grew steadily, eventually meriting a rail spur that connected it to the main line. The mine that had first established the town closed, but other industries took its place. Felicity's father's newspaper chronicled the community's evolution from mining camp to proper town. Xavier and Felicity welcomed a son 2 years after Clara's birth, naming him James after Xavier's father. Their family felt complete, their life together rich with purpose and love. Through it all, they maintained certain traditions. Every year on the anniversary of the day they created their handshake, they visited their creek, sitting on the bench Xavier had built. As their children grew, they incorporated them into the ritual, though the original handshake remained exclusively theirs. In 1885, on the 20th anniversary of that summer day by the creek, Xavier and Felicity returned alone, their children now old enough to remain at the ranch with their grandparents. They sat on the bench, weathered by years but still sturdy, watching the water flow past. 20 years, Xavier mused, his hair now threaded with silver at the temples. Sometimes it feels like yesterday we were children sitting on rocks right here. Felicity, still teaching though now as the school's headmistress, nodded. And sometimes it feels like we've lived several lifetimes together. Xavier took her hand, his skin tanned and roughened by years of ranching. Any regrets? She considered the question seriously. Only that we lost those 4 years when you were in Montana. But then, perhaps we needed that separation to become who we were meant to be. Wise as always, he smiled. Though I still maintain I should have kissed you sooner after coming back. You've made up for lost time admirably, she teased. They sat in comfortable silence until the sun began to set. As they prepared to return home, Xavier extended his hand to help her rise. Instead of simply taking it, Felicity positioned her palm against his. Without words, they performed their handshake, the clasp, the twist, the 3 taps, the shake, the hooked pinkies movements etched into muscle memory by decades of repetition. Still ours, Xavier said when they finished. Felicity leaned forward, pressing her lips to his in a kiss that held all the passion of their youth and all the depth of their shared years. Always ours, she whispered against his mouth. Always. Hand in hand, they walked back toward their home, where children and grandchildren awaited, their lives woven together by love, choice, and a secret handshake first shared on a summer day beside a creek when they were 10 years old.